speaker today, JennyRobb, has one of the most unique jobs in the world. As a curator of the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum at The Ohio State University, she presides over the world's largest collection of cartoon and comics materials. She received master's degrees in history and museum studies from Syracuse University, then served as curator of the Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco, California, for 5 years before joining the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum in 2005. Jenny has curated numerous cartoon and comics exhibitions, including Exploring Calvin and Hobbes and The Long March, Civil Rights in Cartoons and Comics. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for this opportunity to tell you about the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum and our very unique collections. Just so I have an idea, have anybody here been to the Billy Ireland Cartoon? Oh my gosh, a lot of you. Fantastic. Okay, great. Well, just so you all know a little bit about us, we're located on the campus of Ohio State University. There we have it. And I hope everybody can see because I'm going to be showing some of our cartoon treasures on the screen here. So I hope everybody is going to be able to see them. If you can and you want to move up here, please feel free to do so. We are part of the university library system. In addition to, let me see if this is working.
It is now. For in the room, yes. For online, no. But it's
okay. I think I lost my.
That's me. See, again, it's me. It's not you.
We got to have a few technical difficulties, right? This is the first time I've spoken in person to a group since the pandemic, so. Okay, there we go. So in addition to our comprehensive collection of books and journals, our holdings also include an extensive art collection, as well as archival materials, such as the papers of professional cartoonists, as well as cartoon organizations and businesses. We also have a massive collection of newspaper comics from a particular collection that I'll be talking about later. Our collection covers comic strips, comic books, political and editorial cartoons, magazine cartoons like what you would see in the New Yorker, as well as graphic novels. That's something that are becoming very popular. We do have a small collection of animation art, but that's not our focus. Our focus really is more on still and print cartoons. So the first question probably on everybody's mind, who was Billy Ireland? Billy Ireland was the cartoonist for the Columbus Dispatch from 1898 until 1935, and he did editorial cartoons as well as a feature called The Passing Show. I have an example here. And this feature commented on current events, things going on in Central Ohio, ways that Central Ohioans were responding to things going on nationally and internationally. It was a very popular feature. I picked this one to show because of the title panel. And I hope you all can see this. Billy's title panels were always really creative. They were always different every single week. And here, the letters are actually germs. These are flu germs. The grip was a name for the flu back in 1916. And you can see a self-caricature of Billy on the right. He's shooting medicine at the flu germs with his cannon there from Fort Sneeze. So we're named after Billy for a number of reasons. One, he was a beloved Columbus cartoonist. Two, he was the mentor to our founding donor, Milton Caniff, who was a very famous cartoonist, did the comic strips Terry and the Pirates and Steve Canyon. He was an Ohio State alum, and he gave his collection to the libraries in the 1970s, which is how we got started. But also Billy Ireland's descendants gave us our lead gift of $7 million for our new building project. And we opened our new facility in 2013 in Sullivan Hall, as I mentioned. So we're very grateful to Billy's family for that gift. So what I'd like to do today is show you some highlights of our collections and tell you some of the fascinating stories behind them. So I'm going to start with one of the oldest items in our collection and also one of the largest. This is the Hale Scrapbook. Do we have any scrapbookers here in the audience? Anybody know any scrapbookers? It's become very popular. It was also popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, and this is a A particularly interesting example, it contains rare British cartoons, engravings, letters, and clippings that date from about 1750 to 1830. So if you think of Jane Austen's lifetime, that's what this book comes from. Now, it was probably made to document the history of the time, but also as a form of entertainment. So people, when you didn't have TV or movies, you would sit around in the evenings and you would get out this scrapbook and laugh at all the cartoons, and this would be something that would be a form of entertainment. But I'd like to show you a couple, this is a picture, a very old picture of me, just to give you an idea of the scale of the book. So I'm going to show two cartoons. This one is one of my favorites. It's called The Female Philosopher Smelling Out the Comet. It's a cartoon from 1790 about an extraordinary woman named Carolyn Herschel. She was actually an astronomer who discovered a number of comets. And she was the very first woman known to receive a salary to be a scientist. She was also the first woman to be awarded a gold medal by the Royal Astronomical Society. That was in 1828. And just to show you how far ahead of her time she was, the gold medal was not awarded to another woman until 1996. And you can see that she was ridiculed in the popular culture of the time, including this cartoon. So the thing up in the top there is meant to be a meteor or a comet. And what it's doing is farting in her direction. So little commentary here on what this cartoonist thought of women stepping outside of their domestic sphere to do science. And the next one I'm going to show, we're coming up, of course, on tax season. So even though this is 200 years old, I think we can all appreciate it and understand it. John Bull and his family take leave of the income tax. So John Bull was the symbol of Britain, or kind of the everyman, the British everyman. And of course, the monster symbolizes the tax collector. He says, "Farewell, Johnny, remember me," as he flies off with the money. And there's, the poor look on John Bull's face as he says goodbye to his taxes. So the next item I've chosen is one of our earliest American cartoons. Of course, there's a lot of talk about how divided and intensely partisan we are now in this country, and so I thought this one was particularly interesting. It depicts an actual incident, an altercation, that took place on the floor of Congress in 1798. Now, back then there were two parties, the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans, and the background to this scene is that the Jeffersonian Matthew Lyon from Vermont insulted the Federalist Roger Griswold from Connecticut, who retaliated by calling Lyon a coward. Lyon responded by spitting tobacco juice directly in Griswold's face. And when Congress subsequently failed to get enough votes to expel Lyon for this behavior, Griswold avenged his damaged honor by attacking Lyon with a cane in the House chambers. So Lyon then grabbed the fireplace tongs to defend himself, and the two of them went at it on the floor of Congress, to the glee of some of their colleagues, as you can see, at least according to this cartoonist. Things haven't changed much. Who won? That's a good question. They were eventually pulled apart, and order and peace was restored. So true crime is something that is very popular now. So I picked this item from our collections because its origins are in actual unsolved criminal events in Victorian England. So you've probably all heard of Jack the Ripper. But there was another Jack in England who struck terror in people's hearts. Throughout the 19th century, there were multiple reports, mostly from women, that a supernatural devil-like creature jumped out and attacked them when they were walking home at night. And the creature was eventually dubbed Spring-Heeled Jack because of his ability to leap high into the air, some said even over buildings and houses. So Spring-Heeled Jack became the stuff of urban legend, and stories were told about him in popular culture, including something called penny dreadfuls, which is what we have here. These were cheap, sensationalized fiction that were all the rage in 19th century England. And they often featured dramatic and gothic stories of detectives and criminals and the supernatural. And they were serialized over multiple issues that only cost a penny, so most everyone could afford them. But this particular story is critical to the evolution of comic books because it took the creature Spring-Heeled Jack in a little bit of a different direction. So he's not portrayed as an evil villain, but actually as a costumed, altruistic vigilante, an avenger of wrongs and a protector of the innocent, like women. And this is, of course, a precursor to pulp fiction characters and comic book superheroes like Batman. And in fact, to the story, he's even described as having a bat-like body and a costume that he wears. In this particular version, he turns out to be a wrong nobleman who was tricked out of his inheritance by an evil cousin. So we recently celebrated the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. This cartoon was published 4 decades before the suffragists were finally victorious in 1880, and I think it shows some of the challenges that women faced in their journey, that long battle. This was published in a popular humor magazine in the US called Puck. And Puck and the cartoonist Kepler were generally pretty progressive. They supported the oppressed and the downtrodden. They were against corruption and monopolies. But in 1880, they were definitely not on board with women's suffrage. And this cartoon depicts the horrifying and scandalous things that would happen if women were allowed to vote. So I know, again, it's hard to see in the back, but the central image is lovely woman, having removed her political disabilities, her female clothes, is prepared to vote. And there she's standing on a book that says female deportment and modesty. There's a cookbook that's overturned and ignored, so she's neglecting her duties as a housewife. She's reaching for a cigar, scandalous. And my favorite, there's a tonic next to her that says whiskers forced to grow. And in fact, she has whiskers. So, if you vote, you have to grow whiskers too, I guess. Right above that, we see that the sewing machine is superseded by the political machine or the ballot box. You see women again dressed in masculine clothes at the time, pulling the ballot box. In the left corner is this idyllic scene that will be nevermore, nevermore. And what you'll have is on the right, the wife is out electioneering, and of course the man is just making a debacle of the housework and the child care. And then the one that I find particularly insulting, on the bottom right, you have the ugly-looking man is driven from the polls while the handsome fool gets the office. So obviously women would only vote on candidates based on their looks. So the cartoon, of course, is humorous, but it does reflect the attitudes and beliefs of its creator, as well as the middle and upper class audience, mostly male, of Puck magazine. And like all popular culture, it really does also have the ability to influence how people thought about issues. So looking at this cartoon, you can see why it took another 40 years for women to actually get the right to vote in this country. So this is a Japanese cartoon. We have a very large collection of Japanese manga. Manga is just the Japanese word for comics. This is actually from 100 years ago. It was published in a Japanese newspaper. Does anybody have any guess what's going on in the central image there? Any ideas?
Telephone conversation?
Yes, exactly. So when I first saw it, I actually thought she was showering. I was like, why is she wearing her clothes? But what this actually is a prediction of Skype or FaceTime. So you can see they're seeing each other as well as speaking to each other. And again, this is amazing because it's a century ago before they even had television. But the idea here is the man's in Paris, and he's assuring his wife, who's in Japan, between hiccups that he's studying really hard. The punchline being that these conveniences, modern conveniences, are really fantastic, but sometimes they put people in a bind, like this poor guy who's caught partying when he was supposed to be studying. So this is a collection I mentioned earlier. It's the largest collection that we ever received. It's called the San Francisco Academy of Comic Art, and it was the life's work of this man, Bill Blackbeard. That's his real name. And in the 1960s, he wanted to write a history of the American newspaper comic strip, but he became concerned because he realized that libraries around the country were discarding all of their bound volumes, like you see here that he's leaning on, in favor of microfilm. And there's a lot of problems for comic researchers with relying on microfilm, but the main one is that it's black and white. And there were so many beautiful color comics. The Sunday Funnies started in the mid-1890s. You can see here the difference between a microfilm version of a page and the beautiful color version from Mr. Blackbeard's collection. So what he decided to do was start his own nonprofit. He drove his van around the country collecting all these bound volumes that libraries were discarding. And then he brought them back to his house in San Francisco. The basement, the whole first floor is like a big garage. And he basically just stacked all of this newsprint material that he had been collecting from around the country. You can see here ceiling stacks up to the ceiling, maze of narrow aisles with bare bulbs for light. I think this is an incredible fire hazard. I think it's amazing that it never actually caught fire. Here's a picture of Bill standing in front of stacks, floor to ceiling, of newspaper comics. He's holding a page there. The little tabs are his filing system, so that would say like which newspaper or which title. Unfortunately, he lost the lease to this house in 1997, and Ohio State was luckily able to come in and acquire the collection. It took 6 huge semi-trucks to bring it here from California, consisted of over 2.5 million comic strip clippings and pages and newspaper sections that we are still cataloging to this day. It's over 20 years later. But I just want to show you briefly some of the beautiful pages that he rescued. This is a Winsor McCay, Little Nemo in Slumberland, a beautiful comic that featured a kid who would fall asleep, have these adventures, and then always in the last panel he would wake up. This is W.W. Denslow. He's probably best known for illustrating The Wizard of Oz. And this guy is interesting, Lionel Feininger. He did this quirky comic strip featuring kids sailing around the world in the family bathtub, as you do. But he's best known as an expressionist painter and a leader of the famous Bauhaus School of Art. So he has also the distinction of being one of Hitler's degenerate artists. But it's interesting to see how fine artists dabbled in doing comic strips for newspapers. So these amazing works were all rescued by Bill Blackbeard, and they're now housed at our library. Why is it important to save these? Some would argue that jazz and the newspaper comic strip are the only 2 original American art forms. It's debatable, but that has been argued. So I think we're in the last day of celebrating Black History Month, and I wanted to show 2 cartoons from Black creators from the Civil Rights era. These cartoons have interesting and unfortunate parallels to recent events. Black voices were mostly shut out of the mainstream press in the 20th century, including, of course, Black cartoonists. But the Black press, which was owned and published by people of color for an audience of people of color, had its own incredibly talented cartoonists, and one of them was Ollie Harrington. This cartoon is from 1963, the year before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. The caption is, "Here, Brother Bootsy, take this extra hammer I got here in case the gentlemen of the law decides this demonstration is too peaceful." So this is from a feature called Dark Laughter, and the character Bootsy there is often in this feature. He's kind of an everyman. Langston Hughes said of Ollie Harrington and Dark Laughter, "Visually funny almost always. Situation-wise, his pictures frequently have the quality of the blues. Behind their humor often lurks the sadness of when you see me laughing, I'm laughing to keep from crying." Another Pittsburgh Courier cartoonist is Sam Malay. This cartoon was drawn in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968 and the wave of unrest that spread throughout the country in the following week, which in many cities turned violent. The assassination was the spark, but people were certainly also protesting the inequality, the systemic racism, and the discrimination that they faced. Here, Malay is actually critical of extremists on both sides, both white supremacists as well as Black protesters, but he's careful to point out that the resentment and hate that led to the violence was caused by the bigotry and racism that the protesters experienced. So without the white supremacy, the cause, you wouldn't have the violent protest, which is the effect. So it's interesting to have these voices represented. Again, these were not cartoons that would have been published in mainstream newspapers at the time. So we're going to soon be celebrating Women's History Month, so I picked a couple of my favorites. This is Grace Drayton. She was called the Queen of Cute. She was one of the few women newspaper cartoonists in the early 20th century. And this is her feature called Dimples from 1915. Do these characters look familiar to anybody? Anybody recognize those faces? Campbell Soup. Yes. So Grace Drayton also created the Campbell Soup Kids, and almost all of her kid characters look exactly like the Campbell Soup Kids. This is a postcard from 1913 and an advertisement from the 1950s. What's interesting here is the longevity of these characters that she created. She was a real entrepreneur, a very independent woman. She divorced not just once, but twice when divorce was still considered rather scandalous, and she really created quite a career for herself. And more recently, we have Lynne Johnston. Does anybody know For Better, For Worse, the comic strip? Yes? All right. So this debuted in 1978. It was a mix of humor, but also longer stories that tackled more serious issues. And because the characters aged in real time, Lynne was kind of put in a tough spot because people started pointing out that the dog couldn't possibly live that long. And so she decided to use the opportunity to deal with a difficult subject of losing a beloved pet, which most people have experienced. And she did it in a pretty dramatic way. The dog is jumping into the river to save the youngest daughter who had accidentally fallen in the river. But the stress was too much, and his heart gave out. So, they're saying he's not breathing. What's interesting is that this, of course, unfolded over a number of days and weeks in the newspaper, and Lynne started receiving mountains of mail begging her to let Farley live. And then when Farley died, she got a lot of angry hate mail. People were upset. So this is, you can't read this, but this is an example of a typical reader who said, "The front page of my newspaper is ripe with blood and gore. The television is worse. Where can I turn to for relief? The comic strips, maybe? I don't think so. Comics are for escapism, Ms. Johnston. They're not supposed to be a slap in the face with reality." So this reader obviously, only wanted humor in their comics. But what's interesting is she also received a lot of sympathy cards to the Patterson family or to herself for this death, as if it was, a real dog. And then she got tons of letters with people who thanked her for dealing with the loss of a pet in such a sympathetic way. So I think it's a fascinating example of the bond that people have with comic strip characters, especially those that they see every day. They look forward to reading about them every day, and they almost become a part of their own families. So this is my last one. Does anybody know who this creator is? Jeff Stoller does, I know. But yes, the creator of Calvin and Hobbes. So this is Bill Watterson, who created one of the most popular and acclaimed comic strips of all time. He's from Ohio. And we have his collection, including almost all of the original art for Calvin and Hobbes, as well as some of his early work. This is an example of an early comic strip that he submitted to the syndicates to try to get syndicated. A lot of people think really talented people like Bill Watterson are instantly successful. He was not. He submitted many, many ideas that got rejected by all of the syndicates. This one I like. It has a very Calvin and Hobbes-like quality to it, with the characters who are all animals looking up at the stars and philosophizing about life. I don't have time to read it, but I will read this one, which is a typical Calvin and Hobbes strip. "It's getting dark, Calvin. Time to come in and go to bed." "But Hobbes and I are catching fireflies. Can't we stay out a little longer?" "Ha! First you didn't want to go out, and now you don't want to come in. See, by not watching TV, you had more fun, and now you'll have memories of something real you did, not something fake you just watched." And Calvin says, "Nothing spoils fun like finding out it builds character." So this shows the conceit of the comic strip, which is that all the other characters see Hobbes as just a stuffed tiger. But in fact, Calvin sees him as a real tiger and interacts with him as a real tiger, and Hobbes alternately plays the roles of best friend, nemesis, partner in crime, counselor, and straight man. Also, notice Calvin's spiky hair there. This is how the original proposal that Bill Watterson sent to the syndicate, that's also in our collection, and you can see that he had the hair over his eyes. And it was an editor who suggested to Bill Watterson, you might want to show the eyes of your main character because you're going to need to be able to show emotion on his face. And so Bill Watterson took that to heart and actually redesigned the character to have that famous spiky haircut. So a case of good editing, I would say. So this is just a tiny sampling. I tried to give you a real range of the types of things that we have in our museum and our library collection. I hope all of you have a chance to visit. Currently, we have Power Lines, Comics and the Environment, on display in one of our galleries. And in the other one, we have Dark Laughter Revisited, The Life and Times of Ollie Harrington. I showed you the Ollie Harrington cartoons. And in fact, this Saturday, we have a special event to celebrate this exhibition and to celebrate Ollie Harrington. I think it starts at 5 o'clock at our library. It's one of our first in-person events since the pandemic, so we'll see how that goes. These are both open till May 8th, as well as a permanent collection gallery, our Treasures Gallery, which features highlights of our collection. We also have a permanent display of Calvin and Hobbes artwork, since he's one of the most popular collections that we have. I will also say that admission to our library is free. There is parking at the Ohio Union garages, which are just steps away. It does cost to park there, but it doesn't cost anything to get into the museum. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions if there's time. Yes?
I'm not sure I understood. When you said Pittsburgh Courier,
Yes.
didn't you say that the mainstream papers would not carry those cartoons?
Right, the Pittsburgh Courier
So it's not a mainstream.
it was part of the Black Press.
Okay.
Like the Chicago Defender and other newspapers. But Pittsburgh Courier had a national distribution, so it reached all across the country.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
I happened to be working near Pittsburgh in that period, and it was a nasty situation. I just will comment that looking back over 2 generations, probably the best source of child-raising information is the comic strips. If it's in the comic strip, it's a problem everybody has.
That's a good point. That's a good point, because they really are trying to appeal to a wide audience.
And it's amazing the extent to which they do that in 4 little pictures.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. What else do we have? Yeah.
I have 2 questions. What's the future of comics with the demise of the newspaper? I'm assuming the way those people get paid is newspapers subscribing to their comic, and if newspapers don't have any money, I mean, I don't know anybody that subscribes to a digital Peanuts cartoon every day to keep the money flowing. That was my first question. The second question is, I try and read the serious comics on Sunday, and they bore me to death. What am I missing? I mean, comics means it's supposed to be funny. Well, how do so many comics make it that aren't funny?
So, okay, I'll answer your first one, and then we'll get a second one. The first one is that's a huge topic of conversation and concern amongst cartoonists, because obviously a way to reach the entire country and the world was through newspapers, and that's really changing a lot. Most people who are consuming comic strips now and editorial cartoons are probably doing so online. And there are different subscription services. Some cartoonists have found other ways to make a living. Patreon is a good example. They're still syndicated to different publications, but it is a really troubling issue that's being discussed a lot. The distribution of something like Calvin and Hobbes was so much wider than any strip today because of that. But we are seeing cartoonists adjusting and learning and finding new ways to get their work out there. Technology has always been a controlling factor in terms of cartoons. Back in the day, cartoons were engravings and etchings, and they were sold in a shop that people would go to and buy them directly there. They moved into magazines and then into newspapers, and now we're seeing them move online. So there are some hopeful things. We're seeing an explosion of comics in the form of longer form stories, both humorous and not humorous, and what we're calling graphic novels. It's a terrible name, but that is a positive thing that we're seeing in the industry. And your second question, the serious comics. So I think it depends on what your tastes are. In the 20th century, about the 1930s, we saw the rise of the serial adventure comic. Some of them had humor, but they were also serious. Also the rise of soap opera comics. But people enjoy, reading the stories from day to day and finding out what happens. And that was one of the reasons newspapers love that type of thing, because you had to buy the paper every day in order to see what happened in the story. But I think it's interesting that whenever newspapers try to drop any of those strips, even some of the ones that some people would think, well, who's reading this? It turns out somebody's reading it, and that person, those people tend to be very vocal, and they don't like it when a strip gets dropped.
He's an undertaker.
Takes a lot to get him moved.
My family and I have gone to the Billy Ireland Connection before, like several years ago. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
So we're really happy, that it's open and we can go back. And my question is, do you guys have a relationship with the Columbus? I think it's like Comics Crossroads.
Yes,
or-
Cartoon Crossroads Columbus.
about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a festival that was founded, I think we're on our 8th year, coming up on our 8th year. Billy Ireland is involved along with a number of other arts organizations, museums and libraries in the Columbus community. The idea is to bring special guest cartoonists, to celebrate cartooning and cartoonists, to really put a focus on them. We usually have a couple days of programming up at Ohio State's campus, at the Wexner Center and at the Billy Ireland. And then everything moves downtown, and there's a big expo at the Columbus Metropolitan Library, as well as programming at CCAD and some other places. So it's just an opportunity to celebrate not only cartoonists, but Columbus as a city. So we're hoping to draw people here who will then be able to explore the city itself. And that's one of the reasons why we move the event around town, so they get to experience different parts of Columbus. And it's called Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, and it's taking place, I think, the first weekend in October this year. We were hybrid last year, mostly online. We were, of course, online the year before that, but we're back to hopefully being able to do it completely in person this October. But I can't say enough. It's a really fun time. There's something for everybody. We do lots and lots of different programming, but we also have the expo, where it's a great chance to learn about cartoonists and the work they're producing. And it was founded by our own, Columbus's own Jeff Smith, who's a fantastic cartoonist and graphic novelist. He did the book Bone, which is sold millions of copies around the world. It's a 1,300-page graphic novel that's Bugs Bunny meets Lord of the Rings. And it's absolutely fabulous. We have the original art for that book in our collection as well. And I highly recommend it. But he was one of the founders of Cartoon Crossroads Columbus. Thank you for asking that. Do we have time for one more? Yes? Okay.
In a country like Ukraine, are newspapers as digital, as online as they are here, or are there more papers? Do you have any idea? And the reason I ask is, would that be a source of protest?
Yes, so there's certainly a long tradition of cartoonists, especially editorial or political cartoonists, speaking about all kinds of issues. If I'd known what was going to happen, I have another presentation where I focus on war cartoons, which is really interesting. And in different countries, cartoonists have different freedoms. Here in this country, we of course have the freedom of speech. We can criticize our leaders. I think in Russia right now, if you're a cartoonist, you probably can't criticize Putin. So that's something, we definitely don't want to take for granted, and cartoonists don't take for granted. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because sometimes a cartoonist can sum things up really in just a picture, and can really have an impact on how people see things and how people think. So I would hope, I know the cartoonists in the U.S. are doing a lot on this war and have been leading up to it.
We can do one more.
One more? Okay. Anybody else? Yes?
Well, the conflict over content isn't new. From junior high, we call a little poem. Captain Easy's really great. Superman is swell. I don't like old Mary Worth. She can go to.
I actually have not heard that.
Well, you'd be surprised.
I've got to write that down.
The question was still there in 1955.
Yeah.
Yeah, there has been a long debate. There's been, even since the early days of comic strips, there were people who said our children shouldn't be reading this. This is not appropriate for them. And of course, the famous hearings against the comic books in the 1950s. So that's another talk that I can give to. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you guys next week.